Oops. Going the wrong direction already. Hopefully the screen is up.
Yes, we can see.
Alrighty, great. I have a big block in the middle of my screen saying the meeting's being recorded, and I can't get that off of my screen. So I may miss a few things along the way. We'll see as we go. Anyhow, thanks so much for tuning in tonight. I'm just delighted to be doing this with Becca. She has been fabulous to work with, and just an extraordinary artist and person. And I was very, very blessed to have somehow found her to be part of this endeavor to find out what all the last undeveloped wild lakes are in Wisconsin, where they are, and talk some about why they're important and why we should fall in love with them. So a place is a space with a story. I want to tell some variety of stories, one being the larger story of how many lakes we have left in the state, not many, but also then some individual lake stories and maybe some individual species stories. So we'll go through a variety of different stories, all those stories making up this vast novel of what we call the Wisconsin's North Woods. So some people surprisingly have asked me, why would you want to paddle a wild lake? Well, here's the opposite of a wild lake. So, there's reasons to paddle them for what isn't there. And here's one of the things. And what also isn't on a wild lake are wakeboards and jet skis and huge marinas and lots of houses and piers all along those shorelines. But what is there along those shorelines are wild communities, intact communities by and large of flora and fauna, all of which have stories that can be told. And we don't have a Boundary Waters or a Quetico. Sadly, we just didn't get there somehow. We don't have anything remotely close to that, but nevertheless, we have wilderness kinds of areas in lots of our state and federal forests that are very hard to get to. And if you do find them, you will be almost certainly the only one there, because you'll have suffered a great deal to have gotten there. Anyhow, so wildness can be found in small places. And the value of wildness is said very well, I think, by Jack Turner here, where he talks about the experience of qualities without which we wouldn't have magic and spirit. And he uses the word the sacred, and I really buy into that. However you'd like to define that, it doesn't matter to me. But these flora and fauna on these lakes are sacred in the sense that they are remnants of places that were meant to be exactly as they are today. And so that makes them unusual and, to me, sacred. James Kunstler, in his 1993 book, Geography of Nowhere, talks about the homogenization of so much of the United States and talks about chain stores and all these things. And I think that holds true to some degree for a lot of our developed lakes. Many of them start looking like every other developed lake because it's home after home after home and pier after pier after pier. And pretty soon those places basically lose their souls, if you ask me. And so I think what's wonderful about these wild lakes is they still have their soul, if you will. They're still a geography of somewhere. They're not a geography of nowhere, because they still are intact. They still have their personality. They still exist as they were meant to exist. So just quickly, how do undeveloped lakes differ from developed lakes? One of the easy ways to look at this is simply by the plant cover along a shoreline and within a lake. A study done in 1997 looked at that shoreline plant floral community, and you can see the graph. Lots more canopy cover, lots more understory cover, lots more shrub cover. And of course, that's the habitat for all the wildlife that we hope to see along a lake shore as well. And then they did a study at the same time of green frogs, just to kind of look at, all right, so we showed that the floral community is decreased. How does that impact a given species? In this case, green frogs. Green frogs are the ones that make that loose banjo twang. Hopefully you've all heard them in June. And you can, again, look at the graph for yourself, but you see that undeveloped lakes, no homes, have 40 green frogs per mile of shoreline. And as you get to 30 homes per mile, you end up with complete elimination of green frogs. So you could do this for every species. And it would be an interesting study to make on how development of lakes alters wildlife communities. We also looked at birds on developed lakes compared to undeveloped lakes. And this was really fascinating to me because what they found was the abundance of birds was the same. So if you say there were 1,000 birds on a given lake, on a wild lake, there was the same 1,000 birds, same number of birds anyway, on an undeveloped lake, but there was a different constellation of birds. So as you look at this list, they're all good birds, maybe not so good as the grackle. I always have a little trouble with grackles. But anyway, yeah, siskins and phoebes and catbirds and so forth, wonderful birds. But as you then look at birds on wild lakes, it's a very different cadre. And these are birds that primarily are nesters on the ground, or nesters in that shrub layer, or nesters in older mature forests that have been likely cleared along the developed lakes, and are cavity nesters, or birds that nest high in pines or hemlocks. So why else want to paddle or go to a wild lake? Because you don't have to paddle them, you can just walk in and sit along the shoreline, of course. Well, it's an adventure. My wife Mary and I spent 5 years on this adventure trying to find all of these lakes. And here we are, lost again. And we walked into a bunch of them. We biked into a couple because it was logging roads. There was no other way to get in there. It was miles and miles. And we portaged into others. And a number of them we were able to drive right up to and put in at a boat landing. Savage Lake was one I show here that we really had trouble finding. But once we got there, then there's a short portage in, not hard to do. And in fact, in the book, there was probably 10 lakes that we had on maps, but we could never get to. We couldn't find them. We could maybe have found them GPS in our way in, but we would have had to have crossed a big bog or wetland, or go through all kinds of downed timber or whatever it might have been, but we were discouraged from even trying. So I acknowledge that in the book and say, yeah, here's one for you to discover on your own. Why else paddle these lakes? Well, it's frankly a spiritual, again, however you'd like to define that, endeavor. I love this quote by Wallace Nichols: "The best and biggest benefits of water are all emotional. We love being in, on, under, around, or near it. Try as we might, no amount of data, MRI scans, EEG readings, or various research projects can show us exactly what we feel at those moments." Here I am putting in on a little lake called Aurora Lake in Vilas County, and it's a wild rice lake, and there's almost never anybody on it. It's full of bird life. My goodness, it's just such a release emotionally to be in such a quiet place, such a peaceful place. Just you, the wild rice, and all the birds associated with that, and other organisms, of course. But it's emotional, and I would go so far as to say spiritual. So, what are the values of wild lakes? They support a fully functioning array of species, a natural array. So it's a community of life that may not be seen on a developed lake. Not only supports the individual species, but supports the diversity of habitats and processes and interactions between all those species, which may be interrupted on a developed lake. It's also a storehouse of genetic diversity. It's a parts inventory. First law is to always keep all the parts. And so if these are sites, again, intact. And if we need to ever find some of these species to reproduce, to take into a developed site that has lost them, here they are. They're scientific benchmarks for what's normal. What's intriguing to me is, in speaking with the director of the Trout Lake Limnology Lab many years ago, I asked him what all they were trying to learn through their many hundreds of studies. And he said, well, we're still trying to figure out what's normal. I thought that was fascinating. So these wild lakes can give us at least a sense of what's normal, but they do vastly differ. And we're going to talk about that briefly in a moment. There's also the educational values, recreational values, and really important, I think, are the beauty values. We need beauty as well as bread. So it's really important to surround yourself with beauty. Put yourself in the way of grace. So, and they're a reservoir of peace. So the last reason I think to paddle these lakes, to visit them, is to fall in love more deeply with the world. And when you fall in love with this world, you protect it. We only protect what we love. We only grieve for what we love and what we can name, and so forth, says Oliver Leopold. And you do it slowly. You do it bird by bird and flower by flower, and it's a lifetime endeavor, one you'll never complete. You won't complete it in dozens of lifetimes, but it's a wonderful wonderful endeavor. Just so exciting to always be on a lake and trying to figure out what all's there and to connect with it as best you can. So how did I go about doing this book? Well, I bought every single dang plat book there was for all the northern counties. And then I looked at all kinds of topo maps. And then I went into the DNR website, which is wonderful for lakes. You can pop in any lake in all of Wisconsin, and it'll come up with the data I'm showing you there in the bottom of this slide of the features and fish and so forth and so on. And so that was very, very helpful. And so I tried to put all those together and then try to figure out how to drive to all these places. And many of them, again, were way back in different places. So how do you even get into them? And then you're looking at Google Maps and hoping that from the air you can figure out some old logging trail. But it was an adventure, no question about that. So what did we find? We found a lot of really small and shallow lakes were the ones that were left as wild. And that makes sense. The ones that were developed first were the larger lakes that are sandy with the archetypal pines all along the shorelines. So those big, beautiful lakes were taken first, and those that were smallest and shallowest and may have had names like Leech Lake and Mud Lake and so forth were ones left behind for others to maybe populate someday, but which have not been populated. And a lot of these are very small lakes. Most of them are like this example of Wildness in Oneida County, highly high density of lakes in these counties are less than 10 acres more often than not, and they're very shallow more often than not. Nevertheless, Wildness County in particular has the density, one of the highest densities of lakes in the entire world. So this is, Wisconsin is globally important for its lakes. So what I found, Mary, my wife and I found were 136 completely undeveloped lakes, meaning they were surrounded entirely by public lands that we arbitrarily decided had to be more than 30 acres. There's more undeveloped lakes that are less than 30 acres, but they're rather small, and it was just too big to try to figure all them out. So we arbitrarily set that limit of 30 acres, and we found 136. And then in the book, I tried to very subjectively determine what I would call the best of those. I listed 55, and Becca did 55 maps for me, bless her heart, and all kinds of illustrations to help people see what we were seeing on these lakes, and then described another 100 and, oh gosh, what was it? I can't remember, a whole bunch of the rest anyway, in the book. And we use these I use these different definitions of best, highly arguable, but that's what I was playing with. And these lakes vary just dramatically. Here's Pallet Lake up in the left in Vilas County, crystal clear, 26-foot water clarity, hardly any aquatic plants in it. It's a deeper lake, clear bottom lake, sandy. And then you have Aurora Lake, which is 99% muck down here in the bottom, 5-foot maximum depth, full of wild rice. Just this tremendous variation in the quality of these lakes. You can read this quote from E.O. Burge, but what you do when you're looking at a lake is finding all these intricacies. You feel like Sherlock Holmes, and more often than not, I feel like Inspector Clouseau, kind of stumbling around trying to figure out what's here. But it was really fun to try to figure out why lakes just 100 yards apart, same watershed, same everything, were radically different oftentimes. And so I talk about that in the book. I list 10 things for folks to look for when they're paddling a given lake, to try to predetermine for yourself what you might expect to see. And so I'm just going to look at 3 of those. Look first at elevation of lake, its place in the landscape, because lakes at the very top of the landscape are typically seepage lakes. So all of their water comes from precipitation. And then groundwater flows out of those lakes and flows into the next lower lake. So at the height of the sandbox, so where are you in the sandbox? The lower you are, the more minerals via groundwater and via drainage, probably from rivers and streams coming out of those lakes. All that flows into your lake, to your lower lake, and you end up with a much more fertile lake lower in the elevation. And thus it can be a wild lake, but because of where it's placed in the landscape, you may have only 3 or 4 feet of water clarity, and you may have a whole lot of algae, surprisingly. And you'll think, well, what the heck? There's no houses here, but because of the elevational siting of that lake, it changes how many nutrients you'll find in that given lake. So that's one thing to look at on a topo map, is just the elevation. The other thing, one other thing to look at is the shape of the lake itself. So if you look at Renard Lake over here in Bayfield County, 33 acres, but look at how that almost dumbbell shape of it compared to Crystal Lake in Vilas County, almost perfectly round. Think about how many nutrients are imported into Renard Lake, because all of that shoreline, much more shoreline by dint of being a dumbbell shape like that than being round. All those leaves that are going to fall in from all those trees, all the additional groundwater that's going to enter the lake from the land surface, and also runoff from the land surface into that lake. So when you have a lake that's contorted along its shoreline, you tend to have more minerals entering that lake compared to a rounder lake. So that alone will change what the plant scape will be, the floral community will be in the lake, which will change to some extent, of course, the fish communities and the associated wildlife, loons and ospreys and eagles and so forth associated with that plant community. One other thing that I found really interesting was thinking about the food web and how this changes the clarity of the water in a lake, which doesn't make sense when you think about it, but I think it'll make sense as we go through this. Phytoplankton is basically, think of algae, all the microscopic plants within a lake. Zooplankters are the microscopic animals and sometimes barely visible little animals that feed on the phytoplankton. The prey fish are those fish that eat the zooplankters, and the predator fish eat the prey fish. So that's the food web, right? So ecologists understand this, and when you think about it, if you increase the number of predator fish, you're going to decrease the number of prey fish. If you decrease the number of prey fish, you're going to increase the number of zooplankters. If you increase and if you have an increased number of zooplankters, you're going to have fewer phytoplankton. Okay, so the DNR did this study down in Madison, 12-year project where they introduced these amazing numbers of walleye and northern pike, a biomanipulation experiment, with the idea of trying to clean up the lakes, that particular lake in Madison, and it worked. My recall this is they got about a 2 or 3 foot better water clarity by dint of increasing the number of predators and via the food web, therefore decreasing the phytoplankton. But then, to confound matters, spiny water flea, invasive species, was brought in inadvertently, and it eats Daphnia, which is a zooplankton, and they graze on the algae. So if you reduce the Daphnia, reduce the zooplankters, and the phytoplankton increases, ultimately they decrease the water clarity by 3 feet. Who knew that was going to happen? But what an interesting experiment. So there's a whole lot of ways to look at lakes and try to understand why you're seeing some lake that's clearer than others, and what the associated plants and animals are to those. So what I wanted to do quickly, got to give time here for Becca for sure, is look at one wild lake from 10 counties. So just do a sampler of what we looked at through all these years at various lakes. So see, these are some of my favorites. So let's go to Ashland County, where there's Mineral Lake, one of the larger lakes that's wild left in the state. The topo map shows houses on the peninsula coming down, but those houses have all been bought by the Forest Service and are no longer utilized. They're empty, and the campground at the bottom is also closed down. So you have this beautiful, rather large wild lake, though it has a boat ramp, so you can have motorboats on this particular lake. What I found interesting about it is it had a lot of glacial bedrock exposed, which we didn't find on many lakes. And this is, reminiscent of when you get up into Boundary Waters in Quetico, where you see so much bedrock exposed along shoreline. So this was really fun to see a lake that had so much bedrock. The Brunswiler River flows into the south end of Mineral Lake and then flows out of the north end, and it's a wild river. Immediately begins some riffles as it heads out of the lake. So that was fun to see, neat to see. The only lake of all that we paddled where we found purple fringed orchids along the shoreline. I was just shocked to see this particular flower. Beautiful. And then you go to the southern end of the lake. At the northern end is where all this glacial bedrock is. You go to the southern end, and here's the diversity of habitat. There's no bedrock exposed. It's a wetland, a really big wetland with the classic burr reeds and cattails and flourishes and so forth, all the emergent plant life and the associated waterfowl that you'll find in those kind of sites. And then the eagles sitting over the top watching the waterfowl, and this whole community of life. The Mineral Lake lies within the Brunsweiler River Mineral Lake State Natural Area, 523 acres. So it's a big site. So what's doubly interesting to me, and why a lake like this would make my top 55, is when it's surrounded on the landscape by a state natural area, which is a protected area by and large. Not always, but most usually. That means you have a wild landscape as well as a wild waterscape. Let's move on to Bayfield County and go look at Totogatik Lake. 537 acres. This was the largest wild lake left in the state. Remember, 640 acres is a square mile. So we don't have any lakes that are a square mile or more that are completely undeveloped left in the state. But what's fabulous about Totogatik is that it's a wild rice lake end to end. I think the maximum water was 7 feet, something of that sort, and usually more shallow. So if you're a wild rice aficionado, this is Mecca for you. My wife and I paddled this late September after the rice harvest. You don't want to paddle a wild rice lake while the rice is getting close to ripening because you'll knock the rice out off the stalks. But anyway, here we are paddling through all the rice, which can be a lot of work, but it's just darn pretty in there. And all that wild rice is home not only to a lot of birds, but home to all of our aquatic, semi-aquatic mammals, otters and beavers, muskrats, mink, so forth. So, and the waterfowl are just exceptional at a site like this, from the male and female wood ducks to green-winged teals and ring-necked ducks. Just a great site for bird life, but not a place you're going to want to swim. It's muck bottom. It's one of those where you put your paddle down and it goes down and down and down. And you think it's going to come out in China, but it's a fabulous place for the wildlife value. Let's move over to Door County. The only lake I could find in that county that met my 30-acre plus criteria was Mud Lake State Natural Area. And guess what? It's only a 5-foot maximum depth, thus called Mud Lake, but large, 169 acres. And where you put in is at the very southern end of the lake on this map, and that little blue area down there at the bottom, that lake that you see, well, that's Lake Michigan. That's Moonlight Bay. So you're putting in right on the edge of Lake Michigan as you're paddling upstream into Mud Lake. And again, what's cool about this particular site is how much public land there is, in this case, via the Nature Conservancy, that's owned a wild landscape around the lake itself. Here's the put in. Lovely, I think we were there in August afternoon, we were going. And you start off, you're paddling through a bunch of wild rice and other aquatic plants, and then things start opening up into the lake, and pretty soon it opens wide open, and there's a pier there that you can see in the distance that was just put in this summer. And so if you didn't want to paddle it, if you just wanted to go sit on the edge of this lake, I think that's a lovely thing to have done. Now, some people would argue that makes it less of a wild lake. Well, it's not a pier for anybody to put in their boats particularly. It's more of a pier because you have to, well, you could put in a boat from there, but you can't drive up to it. You have to portage your way into it to get to that pier, or walk in, as the case may be, and without a boat. And I just think it'd be lovely to sit there at a sunrise. And this is a place loaded with birds because it's right along far northern Lake Michigan, and Lake Michigan and the Bay of Green Bay is loaded with white pelicans, as I'm sure you all know that down in Manitowoc. All that Fox River Valley area is Pelican City these days, and other birds like great egrets and gosh, all kinds of terns and gulls and cormorants. It's just a fabulous lake for wildlife. Let's move over into Florence County. Here's Grandma Lake, 42 acres, another one of these very shallow lakes surrounded entirely by wetland. I'm trying to figure out who the grandma might be, but I've been wondering if maybe just the shape of the lake kind of looks like somebody's grandmother. Once they got a little older, got a little more rotund. Maybe that's why it's called that. What was fun was trying to figure out the names of some of these lakes, and I found a few, but a lot of them are still unclear to me why they're named what they're named. What's wonderful about Grandma Lake is it's a state natural area, 475 acres, but it is also a federal research area. And we only have 19, maybe 17 or 19, can't remember which, federal research natural areas in our state, whereas we have 675 state natural areas. So when you have something combined where it's both a state natural area and a research natural area, you know you got a pretty great spot for a truly intact community of life. Well, here's where you park. Classic for a lot of state natural areas is you have a little sign kind of stuck in the woods, and if you're not looking, you aren't going to see it. And there might be, in this case, there was a tiny little pull off for one car. And then we had to portage in like 10 or 15 minutes, and here's the put in. Well, that's not much of a put in. What you have to do is walk across the bog to get to the lake. But what's the value of suffering a bit to go across that bog? Well, orchids, lots of orchids, and lots of just wetland plants, from the carnivorous pitcher plant to blue flag iris to a variety of various sedges, most of which I can't identify still yet. One of these days, maybe I'll learn my sedges, but here's tussock sedge. I know. But a wonderful constellation of flora all along the edge of this lake. Let's go a little bit west of Florence County to Forest County, and here's the mix between those and the three islands, with lakes to the north and south. This is a great site because there's lots of other wild lakes nearby. About that in a minute. So here's the put in. There's a little campsite for one campsite right here that you could have this lake all to yourself. Put in this little muddy spot. And what's awesome about this particular lake is all the logs that have fallen into the water, all the trees that have fallen into the water over decades and decades. And they've become colonized by moss, and then the moss becomes colonized by bog vegetation. So you have these mini ecosystems, many bog ecosystems on all these logs, dozens and dozens of these logs laying in the water all along the shoreline. And they're all populated by dozens and dozens of sundew plants. Sundews are insectivorous plants, if you're not familiar with them. Their leaves have those little rays coming out of the disc-like shape at the end of the leaf. And each of those rays has a little viscous drop of fluid that's sticky as all get out on the end. When hopefully a mosquito lands on there, gets stuck, and the leaf of the sundew slowly over many hours closes over it, and digests that insect, and then opens back up. Great little plant, but just sundews to beat the band on McKinley Lake, all on these logs. We also have rose begonias on the north end of the lake, an orchid which is quite lovely. And then just lots of other beautiful flowers all along the shoreline. Steeplebush and marsh skullcap are just two that I'm showing you. And what I love about this site again is the number of other wild lakes. Pat Shea down in the bottom left is a wild lake. White Deer and Luna Lakes are wild lakes. Up at the top, Three Dutchmen is a wild lake. You have a beautiful nature trail just between Franklin and Butternut Lakes, the Franklin Nature Trail. And then you have a 13-mile long Hidden Lakes Trail, which is just a great trail going through old growth in a number of spots, and otherwise relatively mature forest the rest of the way. So I like going to lakes now, so you paddle it once, but then what? Well, here's, you can do all this hiking, and nearby are a bunch of other lakes you can hop onto. And this is a great site, highly recommended. Iron County, where I live, in the little tiny crossroads here of Manitowish. If you look at the Manitowish River and Highway 47, we're that last little black dot closest to the river. We own 7 acres on either side of the river there, and we're right next to the Frog Lake and Pine State Natural Area. Frog Lake's just a half mile to the south. Here's an aerial view of Frog looking down upon it. And the Manitowish River forms the western boundary of this state natural area, 1,290 acres. You can put in at our house on the river and go down to the Turtle Flambeau flowage if you like. Take you about 6 hours or so to get there. No houses the whole way, which is another good reason for coming into our area of Iron County. We've got a lot of wild lakes right around here. So Plunkett Lake on this map is wild. Kelly Lake is wild. Brush Lake is wild. Sherman Lake is wild down there. Mud Lake is wild. Sandy Beach is wild. And Frog Lake is the one I'm talking about in particular here, but set within what was called not too long ago the Manfish River Wilderness Area. Has been revised to be called the Scenic Area now. Someone didn't like the word wilderness, I guess. The dominant plant on Little Frog Lake is purple bladderwort. Usually when I ask groups if they have any idea what purple bladderwort is or have ever seen one, there's lots of no hands going up. But this is a beautiful little insectivorous plant again, carnivorous plant. It eats a lot of zooplankters swimming around in the water. Cool little plant. There's thousands of these on Frog Lake. And I just wanted to remind folks that it's not always visiting these wild lakes. It's not always about summer. Here we are in the winter. Since we live only a half mile away, we're over there regularly snowshoeing or skiing along the shoreline. These are great places to visit in the winter. In Oneida County, I wanted to look at Kennard Lake, 44 acres, 23 feet max. And what's beautiful about Kennard, amongst many things, is all of the white water lilies, big colonies of white water lilies. You have to lean over your canoe without falling on your face and smell one of these days. If you get a good one, it smells like fresh oranges. Just lovely. And I bought a camera to try to take pictures underwater, and 95% came out blurry, but this one came out good. So here's what it looks like from an underwater standpoint, that whitewater lily colony. It's just beautiful. Lake's full of other aquatic plants, and always remember to think of aquatic plants as the understory of a forest or the prairie. You have to have plant life in the sediments in order to have any other life. You have to have food and cover. So too much of a good thing is a bad thing, but if it's well in balance, it's wonderful. And that's the case here. Rose begonias on the north shore of Kennard. Let's jump into Price County. Tucker Lake is a lake you got to either portage in from the north, or you can paddle across Round Lake at the bottom of the map there to where it says boat access and carry in. It's about a 10-minute carry. And what's wonderful about Tucker Lake is it is a state natural area, and it's a research natural area. It has about 68 acres of true old growth hemlock hardwoods. So that's great. I mean, not only do you get to paddle in a wild remnant lake, you get to walk through a wild remnant forest to get there. Here's our youngest daughter and our mini Australian shepherd who just passed away this fall, but who saw more old growth forests and more wild lakes than any dog probably in the state. But that's what you'll see going to Tucker Lake. And here's just a shot across the lake, a couple trumpeter swans in the distance, and here's their nest on the shoreline of the lake. A couple more counties to go. I'm going to turn it over to Becca. Vilas County has the most lakes of all, and I wanted to particularly point out to you Bittersweet Lake State Natural Area. What's cool about this site is one of the very few sites in the whole state that actually has portage trails between lakes. So those 4 lakes you see there within the state natural area are connected via portage trails. So here's the typical put in, just a little scrape, in you go. And there's campsites, 1 or 2 campsites on each one of these little lakes. And then there's these portage trails between these lakes. Really clear lakes, just a lovely experience to spend a day putzing around on these little lakes. I'm a good putzer in my old age. We need to learn to slow down, don't we? And that's what these wild lakes are meant to make you do. Slow down, breathe deep, inhale peace. And here's another portage going into Smith Lake. And last lake of the 10 I wanted to show you. In this case, it's another one that has portage trails between them. And it's a series of lakes that are smaller than the average that I wanted to reach. Was 30 acres, but because these guys were all connected in Washburn County, the Sawmill Lake Complex, I thought it was worthwhile showing these to folks and recommending they go. These are beautiful little pothole lakes, tiny little lakes. You can paddle across them in no time flat. But then you go over these little tiny portage sites, and you hop onto the next lake. There's a little rustic campground that Mary and I stayed at for 3-4 nights, checking out all of Bayfield County. And we encountered in doing this project, I wanted to point out how much high water there's been in the northern part of the state anyway over the last 8 years. Last summer was dry finally, but we encountered shorelines that were drowned in virtually every lake we visited, where water levels were probably at least 2 feet, often 3 feet above the ordinary high water mark. And trees that were ordinarily on the shoreline were standing in water. This is so very common in this last decade. Osprey nest on one of the lakes. And again, here's a portage. It's just, you go over this little esker and you go down the other side and bingo, you're into another lake. So from a portage standpoint, it's really easy and therefore fun. Which brings me to the end of my part of the presentation. Again, Rebecca was fabulous to work with. I've written a bunch of books, but I've never made one anywhere remotely as close, as pretty as this one. This is just a lovely book because of the maps she did for me, and because of these gorgeous illustrations. I've had more compliments from people around the state about how pretty this book is, and the illustrations are fabulous. So anyhow, just a shout out to Becca and how great the work she does. So I'm going to unshare my screen here and get off and get a chance for stop my share. There we go. And Becca should be able to jump on now, hopefully.
All right, well, thank you, John. I was very interested to hear what you had to say about all those lakes and the creation of the book. And so now I will share my screen. All right, here we go. My part of this project was to create the illustrations and, as John said, the maps. I created 24 illustrations for this book. We'll take a quick look at about half of them here. And I used watercolor to create the vast majority of them. And it felt very special and fitting for me to use water as the agent that that helps the pigment find its place on the paper. It helped me feel connected with the topic. I have some contact information here if you'd like to take a look at more of my work or see some of the process behind the book. But I'd like to bring your attention to this illustration of black terns. This was a special one for me because it also illustrates, I guess you could say, the origin story of the partnership that led me to illustrate Wisconsin's wild lakes. John and I paddled Aliquosh Lake, which is, I think, very fittingly the first featured lake in the book in May of 2017. And that was the first day I ever saw black terns. At this point in my life, I was starting to become very interested in birds. And I was already, you could say, on a set path of no return from somewhat of a fascination, maybe an obsession with birds. To me, the black terns that day really represented something that was wild and truly free. So they've retained that place in my heart to this day. So that day, as John and I paddled on Aliquosh Lake, as we were talking, and again, as I read his introduction to the book that we worked on together, I really appreciate that his words teach me to find a way to articulate the relationship we have with wild places. My practice is to communicate these ideas through visual art. These images, these illustrations paired with John's words, I feel that they offer up an invitation to explore Wisconsin's wild lakes with mindfulness, with curiosity, and I think even with reverence. So here's a little more background. When we paddled Aliquosh that day, I had just graduated from Science Illustration School and I was starting out my new career. I had been selected for an artist in residence program called Drawing Water, which takes place at the Trout Lake Research Station in Vilas County near Boulder Junction. During my time there, I met with the on-site staff, the researchers, and partners to gain a full appreciation for the science and the mission of the station. So that's how I met John. He offered to take me out paddling on one of the lakes. This experience was my first real introduction to wild lakes in northern Wisconsin. On the left, you have an example of the kind of vacation photos that fill my computer from that experience and from many since then. Reference photos, such as this one, which is of Labrador tea, give me information to work with back in the studio. There are a lot fewer mosquitoes when I'm working indoors at my drafting table. This is a special illustration to me, white water lilies. It's a great example of how John and I collaborated on this project. And I was thrilled that he touched on this a little bit in his portion of the presentation. By the time I got around to painting, John had already paddled a good number of lakes, and he provided me with a list of potential subjects for illustrations based on everything that he had encountered. His descriptions often inspired an image in my mind. For example, a description he provided of white water lilies as if they were giving the sense of an underwater prairie became inspiration for this watercolor illustration. As I work, my wish is really to honor my subjects with scientific accuracy while sharing that spark of magic that inspires us to love these wild places. For example, you might just look at this illustration for its composition or the sense of light, but a botanist will tell you that you can tell that these are white water lilies because the corners are sharp on the lily pads, whereas for yellow water lilies, they would be rounded. So I do my best to honor that accuracy that will teach us to look more closely. I was happy to be able to include some of the less celebrated characters in this collection of illustrations. On the left, we have a bryozoan colony. This was for John's write-up of Dry Lake in Vilas County, where he obtained some excellent underwater photos for me to use as a reference. Bryozoan colonies often form on submerged plant matter. Each lump is a single colony. They resemble gray jello. Each of the rosettes that you see on the colony's surface is actually made up of a number of tiny individuals called zooids, which you can see in the inset illustration on that left image. On the right, we have caddisflies, which construct cases for themselves in the larval stage. You also see an adult on the bottom. The antennae would normally face forward. It's a common device in entomological illustration to kind of bend the antennae back so that they fit on the page better. You might have heard the term charismatic megafauna before. The charismatic megafauna of northern Wisconsin, you might call them moose, loons, eagles. In the plant world, perhaps orchids, things that get a lot of attention and deservedly because they're magnificent. But there is a real reward to slowing down and making close observations of the smaller and less magnificent members of a natural community. I personally have found that the more I observe and study, my time outdoors takes on a meaning or purpose that is less about a diversion and more for the sense of connection I feel when I'm looking closely. Consequently, I'm also a very slow hiker. This field guide illustration highlights common shoreline plants. Some of them may be familiar to you. These are plants you can find in areas with wet ground, often right along the edge of water. Here are some of the reference photos that I took on the right. And I can remember the moment, the place I was when I took each of these. The top one is a swamp milkweed in Seney Wildlife Refuge up in the UP. And the bottom one is a wild calla from the Spruce Lake Bog in Fond du Lac County. Whenever possible, I hope to find and spend time with subjects in person before I illustrate them. Every animal and every plant has a story and a way of being that I want to experience. That way, when I'm back in my studio, I can relive that experience as I work. I can go back to that shoreline and I can watch the pollinators on the spotted jewelweed. And it makes the whole illustration process much more meaningful to me. Field guide style layouts are some of my favorites to make. Many of us have a few field guides on our shelf. You may have seen before I shared my screen, I have more than a few. I have a pretty big shelf full of them. My wish is for this type of illustration to give readers an idea of what to look for when they're out there. And if they find it, the appreciation of knowing its name and its context among similar species. One thing I loved about illustrating this book is the opportunity it gave me to learn. We weren't able to cover all of the topics that we probably could have in illustrations, but I feel like we chose topics that covered a variety of life associated with lakes. I had never seen, nor was I aware of, the spiny soft-shelled turtle, which I'm now on a mission to, to observe at some point. And mussels are a mysterious world to me. But the more I looked into the ecology, I was fascinated. The larger illustration on the bottom of the fat mucket illustrates something very interesting and unique. The relationship that this mussel has with fish. It is able to set out a lure to attract the fish that assist it in its reproductive cycle. Some of the illustrations in the book had a background painted in. Placing a subject in a full background environment adds a real exciting narrative to the illustration that you don't really get in the field guides. These images have a different purpose. They invite us to the lake of the trumpeter swans, or they invite us to wade in with the moose as it snacks on the underwater vegetation. So those were some special ones. The last piece I'm going to share with you tonight is the loon. A loon was going to be in this book, right? The loon is so emblematic of Wisconsin's northern lakes, particularly the wild ones. For me, painting this loon was dessert. This was the last illustration I painted. I tried it in watercolor first, but the loon is so bold and opaque, and it begged to be painted in acrylic. The split view over under with a hint of water, I felt was a very interactive composition to engage the viewer with different things about the loon. For example, how its legs are so far to the back of its body, which make it difficult for the loon to be happy on dry land, but make it an excellent swimmer and diver. Before I give this back to John and Jessica, so we can take some questions, just want to say my time in nature has given me so much, and working on this book has been special because it gives me the opportunity to contribute or give something back in a way by creating something that will make these experiences in nature more accessible to others. I'd also like to share that if you're interested in seeing some of these illustrations in person, there are 2 upcoming exhibitions that will include a good share of the illustrations from this book. The Ridges Sanctuary in Bailey's Harbor is hosting a festival of nature this summer. And these illustrations will be on view in the Nature Center at the Ridges between May 26th and August 7th. Additional interest, John is the keynote speaker for the event. And Mary Burns will have some fiber art also on display. Next, the Rahr West Art Museum in Manitowoc will have an exhibit featuring the illustrations from this book November 13th of this year through February 2nd in 2023. All right, so I'm going to stop share, and Jess, we can hand it back over to you.